starting out with more of just a general overview. So what is the data layer? How exactly does it work? What are some of those different concepts? And why exactly would you be wanting to use and implement this? Next thing we'll go through is the importance. So a little bit more into that why. I know a lot of people that we'll speak with need to make more of a business case for giving resources and taking engineering time in order to be able to develop their data layer. So we'll go through the importance and really how it can help not only in an initial tag implementation, but also moving forward as a foundation for all that tag management. We'll then go through the structure. So what it is that you're going to need to gather in order to be able to put together and develop and architect the structure of your data layer, as well as the technical aspects of what goes into that, how exactly it's working, what you need to do to initialize the data layer, what you need to do for pushing additional context, tracking different events. We'll go through that technical implementation, what that looks like. We have some code samples. Tyler will get into exactly how that's working. We'll go through how to leverage your data layer object within a tag management system. And then at the end, we'll wrap up with summary and any outstanding questions at that point. Happy to go through those. But again, I encourage you, ask questions, let us know if anything is confusing, as well as if you want us to elaborate in any place. So to get started here, I'll actually let Tyler go through and explain, kind of technically exactly what it is. What is the data layer? What is it exactly that we're talking about? And then I'll go through and explain that in, from the business standpoint, what it means.
Okay, so some of you may be familiar with different coding languages and some may not. So I'll speak in coding terms, but I'll also do a little bit to try to explain what exactly that means. And when we're talking about in the web, there's both XML markup languages and scripting languages. So HTML, or what your web page is made of, is a markup language, but then there's scripting, which is how we interact with things and do dynamic things. And the scripting language we typically use is JavaScript. So the data layer is an array in the JavaScript language. Well, what is an array? You might be asking. For those that don't really understand, an array is a collection of things. It's a comma-separated list of like things. So it might be an array of numbers. It might be an array of words. It might be an array of different things. Well, the data layer is an array of objects. So you're going to wonder what exactly is an object. And an object in simplest terms is a set of key value pairs. And in the case of the data layer, our key value pairs are things that we might want to be tracking on a page, like, for example, user IDs, or last visited campaign, or maybe an event that had happened. But it's essentially the data. So in its essence, from a technical standpoint, the data layer is an array of objects that contain page level data that we're going to want to track in analytics. So you can think of it from a technical perspective. It is a single point that holds all the data you might need for a page. You can pass in these objects, or these key value pairs, and set all of the values that you might need from a tagging or analytical perspective with a single JavaScript object, which makes implementation much easier in the future.
Yeah. So as Tyler was mentioning there, from a technical standpoint, your data layer is just a JavaScript object on the page in which you're pushing additional data points to. So looking at that, the visual that I have there on the slide, big hat tip to our friends over at Telium for developing that visual. I think it's the best way of describing or at least visualizing what exactly the data layer does. So it's just a layer. If you think of it, your top layer or your front end would be the web application. So what your users are actually looking at, what they're actually interacting with. And then the bottom layer you would be your backend system. So where your content lives, where the e-commerce platform, where all that information lives, where your product information lives, And then the data layer sits in between, plugging into all those different places, your content management system, your e-commerce system, any other sort of advertising platforms that you might be working with that are showing campaigns or showing ads on your website. Your data layer is plugging into all those different places, pulling together the key data points that you need, and then surfacing them in one place to make easily accessible by things that are sitting up on that application layer or the top layer of your website, which would be your tracking tags, your analytics platforms, those sorts of things. So the tags that need to access that information, as opposed to having to scrape it from that top application layer, they're able to reference one central place in the middle where everything is organized. So it's working by plugging into the back-end systems, organizing all that information in one central place. And then with the application with the tag management system, you can point to that data layer and then actually utilize those different data points and different key value pairs that are being surfaced within your data layer. This is an example of just what a data layer can look like. This would be in your developer's console on your website. So as you can see here, data layer, it's an array of multiple different objects. Within each of these different objects is different contextual information. So you have product information there. You have information about the page, so data that's coming from the content management system. The product information, as well as then events. You can see there in that fifth object down there, sixth object, that you scroll. So different other things that you can configure where you're pushing in those interaction events or pushing in objects on actual interaction to be able to collect information about that user behavior. A really good kind of analogy that we always like to use is your data layer is kind of like a toolbox. So on the left there, you've got a lot of stuff, and it's all technically in one place, but it's not really usable. You're going to have to dig through and do a whole lot of work just to be able to find that hammer to use for a particular household project. Whereas once you implement and you architect a really strong and really well organized data layer, your garage begins to look like that on the right, where you have all of your tools easily accessible, each one able to be used. And you can think of the different projects that you would be doing with those tools as the different marketing, advertising, analytics platforms that you're doing on the site. So, I mean, it literally is a project when you're going through and implementing those things. And you're going to need these different tools or these different data points in order to be able to accomplish whatever it is you're trying to accomplish as part of that project. So by having the data layer really well structured, really well organized, everything becomes available, everything becomes neat, and everything, you're aware of exactly where it is to go reference.
To really see the value in this, I want you to think about when you ask a developer, well, where is Facebook ID being stored right now? And he said, well, there's this Facebook object on the page that stores all of these things. And then you say, well, where is Google Analytics IDs being stored? And say, well, there's the Google Analytics object or something on the page. And then they say, well, how are we handling AdWords right now? And then they say, well, how are we handling this marketing campaign? That one, we have this vendor pixel. Where's the data for that coming in? And each time you have a request with each of these different, so if you're typically working with the marketing agencies or you're working with the analytics agencies or you're working with the developers and you're trying to requirement gather around all of this, this is where the advent of the data layer was spawned. Is everybody's pulling all this information from all these different places. Well, certain things need their own objects because of functionality on the page, and that's different than what we're doing. But if we're in the interest of collecting information for marketing or analytics purposes, all of it's generally similar information, so it might be redundant on the page, there might be too much of it somewhere, but it's not organized in a fashion that's easily accessible or unified, so that when you need to go find this, you need to discover, do we have Facebook ID on the page? Do we have Google Analytics IDs on the page? You can simply visit this one place, And like Lucas's example here, it's a nice organized cabinet that you're looking at. So if Google Analytics ID is this drill, well, yeah, there it is, front and center. I just looked into my organized place, and there's the information that I need. Rather than wondering, well, what would the object be named? How would it be stored in that object? How does this work? You can build a system around interfacing with this data layer so that you no longer wonder what data is making into my points. As long as the data can make it to this point, then it's easy to transition into any type of collection. So organize a central point for this data is integral to both your business needs, not even just development, because the communication and development resources it takes will be significantly lessened by having this kind of environment.
So that really a perfect segue into as we talk about the importance and why exactly you would want and need to have a data layer on your website. And the number one thing here is that clean data organization. And as an extension of that, that central place for everything. So you have one place to reference. You know exactly where that is. If you have a new platform, say you're starting to work with a new remarketing vendor. So you're needing to set up some tags for, say, like Criteo, a popular remarketing vendor out there, and you need to be able to pull down product ID information. Not only do you know exactly where to look, because that data layer object, you know what it is, what it's named, but you also know that it's there, so you can always reference that same object and that same different key value pair within that. So on different pages, it becomes uniform. So as an extension of this, you're able to really improve performance as well as optimization. Performance, both from the standpoint of how well your tags are performing and not having any outages in data collection, and that goes to optimization, but also performance when it comes to performance of the website. If you are needing to run a lot of functions on the page, a lot more scripts on the page in order to be able to scrape that information and feed it into a lot of different platforms and a lot of different tags, that is just more that on the user's end, their machine, their browser has to handle. It's going to slow down their experience, make it more difficult for you to obviously reach your ultimate goals of conversions on the website. The last piece here is just the ease of troubleshooting and then management. As I used as an example before, if you're trying to implement a new technology, you know exactly where to go to get the data points that are necessary for that implementation. And if you ever have an issue with a tag or with reporting, you know exactly where to reference in order to be able to troubleshoot, is this ID still there? Or is there some change on the back end that is no longer working? So really to simplify everything with your tag deployment as well as to optimize the data collection practices, that's the importance of the data layer.
I want to speak a little bit more to the easy troubleshooting. Is sometimes looked at as a negative. I see it solely as a positive. But if, say, you have, let's think of a transaction page, and you have a number of marketing tags, a number of analytical tags, a couple things going to data warehouses, lots of things connecting to lots of different places that are all pending off of a transaction. If for some reason one of those, if you're not using a data layer and one of those, a piece of code breaks one of those sources, you're going to have a hard time finding it because unless the people are using that every day, they're not going to see it. There's not a lot of eyes on each individual one. Maybe there is for a specific, tag or whatever you're collecting with. But by having all of these in the same place, you have, if for some reason that ID then was not being populated, you have all the eyes on it. You have everybody from every one of these vendors who's immediately going to notice that this isn't getting collected. Now, it is a single point of failure. So if there is an issue there, then you don't have that transaction ID. And that's where people see it as a negative. However, if you have any kind of QA or testing period where you go through, you're going to catch these kinds of things because everybody that's working in there will notice our things are not working because this ID is not there. So it brings everyone's QAing in together. So all of the eyes, every single piece of the data layer that's being used by a company will get whatever it is will get tested by all the other people that are also using that piece. So your testing gains width, and rather than maybe your Facebook vendor just did botched the job and didn't notice that some ID or pixel wasn't there, but then someone else caught that the same ID that they're using, and it would save you in that instance. So what it really does for the easy troubleshooting is it pulls it all into a centralized place, so you're getting more eyes, more QA with the same QA cycle. Very nice.
All right. So we've covered obviously what the data layer is, how it's working, some of that importance. I want to get into a little bit more of the technical specifics. First around structure, so still a little bit more high level. What it means to put together a measurement plan. So what it is that we need to pull together in order to be able to really drill down and develop this data layer. And then the second piece with the structure, the technical aspects. So some things that you're going to want to be considering and really thinking about as you're building it out from a structure standpoint. So first thing that we're going to need to do is identify that measurement plan. So there's a lot of different aspects that can go into this data layer. As we were mentioning before, you want it to be the central repository and central place for all data points that are needed for all the different tags and pixels on your website. Now, something like your, a Facebook conversion tag is going to need different information than your, say, chat widget and the tracking that you need for that. So we need to understand what are the data requirements for each different tool, as well as what interactions we want to be tracking, for each different tool. And that really starts with understanding what are all the different tags, what are all the different platforms on the website. We start there, and then we move into, okay, for each, what is necessary. From there, we can have a comprehensive list of all the different data points that we are needed, interactions that need to be tracked, and then we can get into actually building out the structure and how we want to organize everything within that data layer. Now, real quick, just to provide a quick example, I know I sit here talk about like the inventory of all tags on the website. One thing, like how that can look, it can be as simple as going through the website with a tool like Tag Inspector and just being able to identify and list out what those different tags are, what exactly they do, where exactly they're loading, how many pages. Even something as basic as this, or even something as basic as just having this first column of the list of tags is really the beginning part on this journey. We have to understand what's there and then understand for each of these platforms exactly what's necessary. So hopping back over to the actual presentation here, we'll get into a little bit of what this looks like. So what are some of these critical data points that are absolutely necessary? Number one, you're going to want to start thinking about page information, page type, page name, user type, user status. And then depending upon the platforms that you're using, you might need some of the optional variables or values such as a hashed email, a user ID, geolocation of your users, things of that nature. So one, a lot of platforms don't really use the page information, but it's going to make it a lot easier on you as in the future, you need to conditionally fire tags and create triggers around when different tags and different platforms are going to need to be firing. Some other critical data points, obviously product information. These are a lot of the contextual types of data points that you're going to need to be collecting, be it in marketing platforms, be it in analytics, be it in advertising platforms. You need to understand, what it is exactly that's being viewed, what it is that's being purchased, and especially things like a unique product ID. So you can do things like dynamic marketing, remarketing, and really targeting and segmentation of users based upon what it is that's interesting them on your site. And then finally, with these different critical data points, content information, if you do have a content site. and then events. And events are those different user interactions that are happening on the website that you're wanting to track. So your automatic timing events, product views, impressions, purchases, the actions that people are taking, and then we can fill that in with the contextual information around your product or your content types of data points. So once we have that comprehensive list, and one note on here that's really important is a lot of this entire process really for what data is necessary to be in your data layer is going to be informed by namely your web analytics platform. I would say 80, 90% of functionality or data that's being collected is going to be a requirement for your web analytics platform. And then some of the other third-party tags, you're just going to layer those requirements on top. Typically, 90% of what's necessary for third-party tags, third-party pixels, be it a Facebook pixel, Criteo, Bluekai, whatever it is going to be also a requirement of your web analytics platform. In many cases, the requirements for that, I mean, I've seen measurement plans 100, 200 pages long. Really breaking down the different interactions, different events that need to be tracked, and then the data points or the context that's going to be necessary for that as well. So we'll get into structure a little bit deeper here in terms of like the order and what needs to be included where as we get into the technical implementation specifics.
Kind of a thought on this. Well, you can think of your structure. Well, one thing, let me make a side point before I even go down this avenue. All of these values, so you can see we'll use this logged in status as the first one for an example on here. So logged in status would be set to not logged in your tag management system using this data layer or whatever you're using to read out of it. Specifically in the GTM data layer, all of these are last touch. So if you were to push that value again, whatever value it'll have the next time will be what it holds. So you can always reset these. Having said that, your data layer, when looked at in order, will tell a story every time. It's telling you the story of what has been interacted with on the page. It's anything that you're interested in on tracking, any events that are coming through, any page information that might change throughout that. So if a user logged in, the story might look like there's a push with logged in status not logged in. Then there's a push to signify the user logged in and changes that value logged in status to something else. But as the values change, as events roll in, they're telling a story about the current state that the page is in and what different states have changed to get it into that state. And you can kind of review. And then based off of what you need to be done at each one of those states, you could fire individual tags to do what they're supposed to do based off the events that are coming through. So it's just a way of kind of structuring the story and information of your page in a way that will coincide with your tags, and you'll be able to kind of push them together.
Yeah, and to that point, things also need to be available in order to be used. So if you're needing something to be, covered from the standpoint of you need something available for a trigger for something to fire, on one of those events that Tyler was talking about. You're going to need that to be in the data layer prior to being available to be used. So as you tell that story, you need to give a little bit of background before getting into the action, if you will. Right. Okay. So as we've gone through, talked about what the data layer is, what needs to be included in there, how to go about collecting those different requirements for your measurement plan and the technical aspects. Now I want to get into a little bit of the more specifics around the technical implementation. So like I was mentioning, making things available. How exactly do we do that? When do we do that? And what does that look like on the website or in your code? So from a super high level, I'll let Tyler fill in the blanks here. But number one key, you need to define your data layer object on every single page. If it's not defined, we can't push anything to it. In our earlier example of trying to clean up and organize the garage, if we don't have a garage, we got nowhere to put the workbench and all the other tools there. So it needs to be defined early at the top of every page. And this definition push should also traditionally include your page information.
Yeah, and pretty much exactly what Lucas is saying. I'm sure anybody that's worked in the space long enough has heard the terms, asynchronous timing. The constant question of, is my data there yet? How quickly does it take my data to load in? Does this tag or data or whatever functionality we're doing, is it going to slow down other things? So when we think about the data layer, one of the benefits is we're not having all this redundant information out there. So it's good that it's in a centralized place. It's not redundant. It's smaller. It's less JavaScript you can run. But also, since everything is relying on this, we need it to be at the top of the page because it needs to be above anything that's going to need to reference any of that data. So when we say page information, there's certain information that may change. Like in my previous example, a user may log in. That changes throughout the page. But when there's certain information that is just the same for each page, or that will essentially be set as soon as they go to a URL. It's specific to that current page that you're on. And that information needs to be loaded in immediately and at the top of the page so that before any kind of tags start to fire off, we have that data available. So the reason we're putting this data layer up so high is because it's, our holy grail of information. It has everything that we need in there, and that's where we're looking.
Yeah. And then, so once we define that, and once we put that on the page, we now have somewhere to push the additional events, additional contextual information to. So those are your data layer.push commands, which we'll show a couple of examples of. But that's where, as a user clicks on a particular product or scrolls down a page, that's where those different events are going to be pushed to the data layer. So first needs to be available, and then we have a place to push those different objects to.
So to talk about a little bit about the term that Lucas is using, push, to someone that knows no code or any idea, they still don't really know what pushing is. What we're doing is we're adding to that collection. We talked about the data layer as a collection, and what it pushes is we're just adding something to that collection. You can think of it as throwing it in the data bucket. Just a push just throws it into the data bucket. And if for some reason one of our key value pairs we talked about is the same, like I said before, it will update the value of that key value pair. So that key will now have the value of the new value. But to those that are a little bit more privy to JavaScript, well, why does this data layer push do all this magically? Now, it only does this magically for GTM. So if you are using GTM, what I'm about to talk about is specific to you. If you are just using the data layer as an object and you're going to write custom JavaScript to read out of it, you should already kind of know how all of this works, but this is not applicable unless you're using the GTM stack, what I'm about to go into. But what GTM has done for you is with the definition of your data layer, they've overridden the push method. Well, what does overriding mean? Well, I said push is a way to push into that collection of the array. Well, they overrode that function in the fact that they've given that function more functionality. So that function doesn't just push into an array anymore. It pushes into that array and also fires tags and manipulates the data if you've told it to manipulate it a certain way. So by using this push function, what they've done is made it so you can interact with different tags and variables and all this other collection just by pushing into this one data layer. So not only is this thing serving as your ability to collect and centralize all your data, it's serving as your ability to fire off different tags dynamically. So if you want to fire 5 tags when somebody clicks on a sign in button, all you need to do is push in that sign in, and the overridden push method will then trigger the tags that are supposed to trigger off that sign in. So it's a little kind of complicated, a little bit to understand. So I'm trying not to go too technical to lose you guys. But in essence, the push is a way to kind of drop more information in the bucket. But when using a data layer that's integrated with the TMS, like the data layer is with GTM, it can do even more with the push command, like physically triggering other tags on the page.
Yeah. And we'll get into a little bit here at the end the interplay between the tag management system and the data layer and how that configuration works. So like what Tyler was mentioning within GTM, creating those triggers to be able to then trigger tags to actually execute on those different push commands to the data layer. One important note here to just always keep in mind, data must be available in the data layer at the time of that tag execution. We see it all the time where there might be a technical issue or just an oversight, more often than not, of data not being available within the data layer when it's first initialized on the page, for example. So you might have product information that gets pushed down towards the bottom of your actual page code, and you're trying to execute your tag on that initial page load. If that information is not available to be captured by the tag, it can't, ride that tag request up to whatever platform it is. So can't emphasize that enough. We see it all the time. It's a very common issue with any sort of data discrepancies. Also want to take a quick moment here to note there are some caveats when it comes to implementation and the data layer for single page applications.
Yeah, so when you're thinking about a single page application, what exactly is different? Well, there's not refreshes. So if a page isn't refreshing, the way that typically the data layer works, or page views in GTM, or anything that's supposed to fire on the initial page view, we're told that the page happened because of a refresh. You click on a link, the page navigates to a new place, and it kind of refreshes the browser. Well, in the new and cool hipster-esque JavaScript worlds, we have Angular and other singular page applications in which the page never actually reloads, it just continually paints itself. So it looks like a new page is loaded, but nothing's actually happening. So this can be a little bit confusing when you're trying to track things, because if we're running a single page e-commerce site and I click I want to buy a new computer, and it pulls up an individual computer. Well, I want to know that I'm on a detail page looking at a detailed computer, and I might need tags I need to fire. Or if I run a non-e-commerce site and someone engaged with one of my blogs or wanted to download something, I want to know that that happened. But when it loaded that new page, I don't really know that it loaded that new page because there was no refresh. There's no way of me figuring this out. So what we do with the data layer in the single page application point is a little bit to reiterate what I said earlier, we manage states. And so each time you can think of that page loading again, our state has changed. We are on a different page. So we've gone over kind of how there's events and different data, page level data. So you would push in an event that would tell the story of what's happening. We would push a data layer event that's going to say virtual page view. And that virtual page view will have what page you're on and the page level data for that page. So where traditionally a page would load and we would have the page level data at the top, and the GTM regular events, just the events of it loading in, would signify that the page view had happened. Now we will have to work with the developers, and when essentially whenever there's a new Angular load or a new Angular painting or whichever framework they're using, it could be Node.js or any of the single page applications. You just work within the framework to identify when that new page is loaded and what are the new variables we need to set. But the data layer is very, very useful when needing to identify these kinds of things, because otherwise you would be in kind of a marketing standstill and you would have to have constant development resources to understand what's happening when, and when we should fire these things. The developers aren't going to understand the business needs as much, or the marketing needs, so there's going to be constant communication back. So just by having this thing kind of control these different state changes can very much help you.
Yes. And then in addition to that, as Tyler mentioned before, the data layer, a value, especially with the interplay with GTM, a value is going to stay the same until it changes, but it will overwrite. So with a single page application, you do need to be cautious because if a value is not overwritten and then it rides, a request at a later time, it might not be the contextual information that you're thinking that it should be, or that it should be. So you do need to overwrite. In some cases, we're getting into out of the scope of this discussion, but clearing the data layer in some different ways of being able to do that on a single page ad. Perfect. So now I want to get into just a few of these examples. So what does it look like? What do the scripts look like? What does it look like when you're initiating the data layer? What do those pushes actually look like? With some examples. A lot of these examples are taken from the Google tag manager data layer and the actual code snippets that would be needed on a site for interplay with that, but provides a great overview regardless of the TMS that you might be using.
Yeah, one thing I want to say about this, I know I keep bringing up GTM or Google Tag Manager, so if just bear with me for a few more seconds if you're not a GTMer. But specifically, when dealing with the GTM data layer here, you need to define it before this definition needs to be before GTM is added to the page, because I can't tell you how many times I've seen this in a live implementation where GTM is added to the page and it defines the data layer, and then immediately after this says data layer equals a new array. So if you were to do this after, you're going to redefine that overridden push method I talked about earlier, that thing that interacts with all of the things that you're going to do. You would be erasing it. I realize this might sound a little confusing. I'm going to backstep and try to say exactly what I said, but from a way higher level. Essentially, this data layer definition, this needs to be added high up on the page before the GTM snippet, because when the GTM snippet runs, it will define the data layer, but it will also look to any previously defined data layers. So if you can define this early on, that's fine, and all of that information will be there when GTM starts to run, so you'll have it all. But if you define it after, you're going to overwrite the information that's currently in GTM, and it'll cause issues with firing. So that's just a little caveat. If I lost you there, don't worry about it. You can always reach out and ask questions around that. That's a little bit more of the technical implementation, but just something to throw in there.
As you can see here, this gets defined, as Tyler mentioned, above the GTM snippet in the Google Tag Manager case, and we are going to want to include that page information, page name, page type, and any sort of user information that's available as well, which typically is available as that page is first being initiated, because in many cases you're pulling it out from the browser. So it's not something where there might be a delay because you need to ping something on the back end, and it takes a while to return. All this information should be available to be there when it's defined. So this here is just a quick example of a transaction page example of that data layer being defined and the structure. Now, one thing that we didn't really touch on with the structure before, a lot of times the structure for how these things are organized on a page, how these different arrays and objects look at your analytics platform. Google Analytics, for example, if you are using GTM, you put the data layer in a particular structure, which makes the data points automatically be collected. So GA, that code, that library is automatically looking for certain key value pairs as they in a certain structure in the data layer. If they're there, it takes no additional configuration work on your end within the tag to be able to collect those different aspects.
Another point I'd like to make, if we could jump back one more time. So this is automatically going to push information into Google Analytics if it's in this structure. So this is a good example. This is a purchase hit that would automatically go to Google Analytics if you have a Google Analytics tag configured. It doesn't just start sending them to a random place if you don't have a tag configured. All you would have to do is configure it in the just have a tag created in the space, and it would do the rest of the heavy lifting just from this push. However, there's infinite value from this data layer push beyond that. Just because it automatically hooks into GA, that's just okay. It's pretty cool. But what's really cool is, are you going to need your purchase ID for other tags? Are you going to need your revenue? Are you going to need coupon? Are you going to need the product arrays? All of this information. This is a perfect example of, think of how many tags might need to know what products were in the basket. Well, how many tags might need to know the transaction ID? How many tags might need to know the revenue? And how many times have you asked your developers to set some random value of all of those things for how many different tags? Pulling them all together into this singular push. Now there's one place to read from, and you can always point to here as your centralized data place for all of this information. I know this is a little bit repetitive, but this is a really good visual for a situation where you would have all of this together, and you could simply set something up in your TMS to point to that information in your data layer and then use it everywhere in your TMS.
Yeah. So I want to touch real quick also on pushes. So we talked about data layer.push, that method, and exactly what that is, how that works. So here's an example, and you can see it's different from when we were defining it. It's not doing a data layer equals an array. We're pushing an object with contextual information. So in this example, you would have your event name. That's what you're going to use as the trigger within the tag management system for your tag. So you would say, Google Analytics transaction fires on a transaction event, and then you have your event category action label that's specific to Google Analytics. It could be anything. It could just be product name, product ID, whatever it is. That's the contextual information for that particular event. But that's what you would then use as the context for the event or for the interaction that happened. So pretty simple. We've gone through the structure, what goes into it, what are the data points, the technical implementation, what that looks like for when to define, as well as what those pushes look like for tracking the different events and then adding that contextual information. Want to do just a little aside here for leveraging with the tag management system. I know we've talked a lot about how GTM specifically is working and how variables and how things and tags reference the data layer. Want to provide a few examples here of that. So when leveraging with the tag management system, obviously within your TMS, you pretty much have three different things. You have variables or macros, you have triggers or firing rules, and then you have your actual tags or your pixels. And the data layer, there's interplay with all three of these.
So essentially, what are we pushing into the data layer? I've said this a few times in this. We're pushing in objects, and objects are key value pairs. So if you want to get the value or the value of a specific key, then you would access the key of that object. Well, in a previous slide where I talked about all of the e-commerce information going in and how we might want to know maybe the name of a product or the idea of a product. And that object, it was an e-commerce object, and then inside that object there is a field called detail, and then inside that detail object there's a field called products. Inside that products object there is an array of products. We want the name of the first product, so arrays are zero indexed instead of we always start counting at one, but computers start at zero. So it would be the zero would be the first slot and then the name of that item. This is just an example of on product detail pages, you typically only have one product on that detail page. So in that product array, you only need to grab that one product's name. This is an example of for every product detail page, this variable in the TMS will hold the name of that product. So if any number of tags need to know for some reason what the name is of the product on any given detail page, you could just say, and they say you need to plug in the name of the products for this tag, you just drop this macro in or this variable into your tag, and it'll automatically fill in that name every time dynamically, and you don't have to worry about it. So there's no reason to contact a developer. You don't need to go in for any extra resources. The developer's already done all the hard work adding the data to the data layer, and from there it becomes a really easy end user experience, and you can just add these variables.
Next aspect here, in addition to obviously the variables, and variables play into this, but your triggers are your firing rules. So when we talk about dynamically firing tags, it might be if you're working with an advertising platform, say DoubleClick Floodlight, and you're needing to evaluate the effectiveness of a particular campaign. Well, that campaign might point to one specific landing page or one specific product, or you need to see how many times was a specific product purchased or added to a bag. That's where these different dynamic triggers or firing rules are going to come in. So configuration of these within your tag management system is going to reference either an event name that, again, you're pushing into the data layer, or it's going to reference the value of some variable that you've already defined.
That variable could be page structure. It could be something that's in the URL. It could be any of the variables that you passed in for the page level data. But that's where you can really use these to kind of manage states. Ultimately, triggers happen in states. And like we said before, the data layer is telling a story. So at each major point or state in that story that you want something to happen, you can create a trigger for that specific state and know that this thing happens then.
Yeah, so this is just sitting on top of the data layer. It's got to be there in the data layer. It's got to be pushed to the data layer, initialized in the data layer. It needs to be in that object. Then here we're referencing that object, and then whenever something is true or something is a certain value, that is when the tags are then doing something. The final piece here is the actual tags. Now the example I have here is of a Facebook tag. I don't know if many of you are working with the new Facebook pixels, but they do have different events that you can track. One of which is a view content event, which you would utilize for views of products on an e-commerce site. As you can see here, custom JavaScript, but it is the track view content, that's the event, and then your content type, content IDs, name, and we're using those variables as we went through before that we've already defined within the tag management system to tell us and to get us the values that we need to then send with the tag. So this tag, it's custom JavaScript within the tag management system, makes it much easier and more dynamic to deploy. I can insert in those variables into my scripts here. So even as those values change on different pages, it's going to be dynamically updated, dynamically populated, and then I can add those conditional triggers as well so that this is only executing on my product view pages or clicks on particular products to get more information.
Yeah, I think Lucas really nailed it. As far as just, I like to break down tags, triggers, and variables as what, when, and how. Variables would be what. It's the information that we're going to pass somewhere, somehow. Triggers are when. When do we need to move this information around? And the tags are the how. And in this case, this little piece of code that you're seeing, this FBQ track, is sending information via this JavaScript library to Facebook. But there's a number of different hows. Sometimes it's just sending a post request. Sometimes it's running a piece of JavaScript. Sometimes it's an image tag. Sometimes it's loading an iframe. But your TMS should support all of the hows, but tags are ultimately going to be the hows. And tags are useless without the what, the variables, and the when to know when they're supposed to fire, which would be the triggers. So they all kind of work together in a system like that. But what the beautiful piece of coding that pulls this all together is a well-defined data layer that tells us all of the whats, all of the whens, and the tags just have to listen to the whats and whens and only execute the hows.
Perfect. So that's really goes through everything. We went through here exactly what the data layer is, why it's important, how exactly it's working, what needs to be included within that, and then how to do so from a technical standpoint. And then kind of finish it up there with just a quick reference in terms of how the tag management system that you might be working with is actually interacting and then utilizing that information that's made available. Any questions at all out there on any aspects of the data layer? Looks like there are a few hands raised. But I don't see any questions coming through. Don't be shy. Okay, good question. So there was a question here around where or how do you see all the data layer values in order to be able to report on them?
So I don't know if report's technically the right word here. I'll do my best to field this. So it depends on what you're wanting to do with the value. So maybe I don't understand the question correctly, so I'm going to answer it two different ways because I think you might be asking two different things. I'll say what the two things I think you might be asking. I think you might be asking, how are you getting the information out of the data layer and knowing where it's going to? So what reporting like from other, vendors or, like AdWords or Facebook marketing or analytics, or you might be asking, how do you verify what's correct in the data layer? So I'll tackle both of those kind of simultaneously. Um, so if you want, as far as getting things to connect from the data layer with the vendors, you would then just set up a variable to read out of the data layer, a trigger to collect when it's supposed to collect, and a tag that is usually supplied by the vendor that tells you what information you should be passing in and when it should be firing. With the collection of those three things, you would then be able to push information into those areas and then do the normal reporting you would do within those frameworks. So, you would look in AdWords to look at the reporting AdWords traditionally gives you based off of things that are happening or, analytics platforms, whatever. If you're asking about physically checking the data layer, with Google Tag Manager specifically, there is a preview tool that will allow you to check the value of every single data layer value on each page load or in each event, each change. It'll update the values. So you can use the preview mode tool, which is really easy to interact with. And that preview mode tool will essentially give you the list of every single possible data layer variable that you have in your container and then show you what the current value is. What Lucas is doing right now is pulling up the data layer on the InfoTrust website. If you don't want to use the preview tool and you just want to look at what's going on the data layer, it's as simple as going into pulling up your JavaScript console. If you're using a Windows machine, you can do Control-Shift-C. I don't know what the command is on Mac to pull that up. And on both, though, however, you can right-click and click to inspect. That'll bring you up to the Elements tab, and then you can just click Console if you're unfamiliar. Just by typing in the word data layer. Lucas's computer's from like 1994, so it's running a little slow.
Very slow.
There's the objects. And so in this particular instance, if I wanted to check something about it, GTM.js, GTM DOM, and GTM load are the events that come in when GTM loads. So those you can trigger things based off of those events. We didn't really get into. We didn't want to make this too GTM specific, so I didn't get into what those events really are. But the GA scroll percentage, this is a tag that we have to measure engagement on how far users are going down a page before they navigate away. It's just a tracking that we have built in. So that's a perfect example of managing state. So the event is GA scroll, and then we have the action is the percentage of scroll depth, and then the category is scroll depth. And essentially, the value will tell us how far they've done, so that value can be any number for whatever numbers we've assigned for the percentage of them. So it doesn't necessarily mean only 1% was scrolled, but we might call the first 25% the number 1, and then the next 25% the number 2. So this is just an example of an event that we're passing in. But if we wanted to know that this was working correctly, we would have to go to the page and then do something that should trigger that event or that state change, enter that state, and then like we've showed you, type in the word data layer here, and I should see my event GA scroll, which is what I wanted to happen, as well as that data also attached to it so that I can know that that's happening correctly.
Yeah. So if you're really just curious about what's there to be able to use and how exactly it needs to be referenced, that would be how we would recommend. Go to the console, type in the actual name of that object. That's going to pull it all out, and then you can see everything within there.
Okay, we have the perfect thing pulled up for this right now. Actually, click around a little bit, Lucas. Just don't go to another page. So
we have what Tyler's referencing. We have one other question.
Sorry, good call.
Asking about the data layer showing the current state, and asking about how we mentioned that it also tells the story of how exactly we got to that state, and just asking for an example of exactly what this looks like and how it's doing this. So,
click a little bit or do something. I don't know what all we have set up on this main page. Just hit the data layer now. So we should have some of those other scroll events. Oh yeah, look at it, it's flying now, coming right through. Just go to like 5. I think so these are still in order from when we collapsed them the first time. So that's how it's capturing that story. It's still a collection of these objects. And since it's a collection of these objects, so here's the other percentages. Something must be going wrong with that scroll tracking because it put 25% in twice. And then 50, it must be firing twice. But you can see as he scrolled, so the different states that we were in, once we scrolled to 50%, it was a new state. Same if we would have clicked a form or something, it works the same. This is just we only have the scroll tracking, I think, on this main page. There's not a lot of tracking going on here. But if we were to scroll through this first page, as we hit 25%, as we hit 50%, as we hit 75%, the state changed. But when that event was pushed in, changing the state, we still persisted the old events. We still have the history of what's happened on the page. So if I wanted to know, if essentially if we had a trigger in GTM for event GA scroll, which we do, and then a tag to send an event on that, I would want to know that for each of these, the GA scroll event came through. And I could go back and look in the data layer and see the history of all of these events that have come through, but then also look at what's the most current state, what's the most current event. And then using preview mode, I can know what are the current values.
So I think that kind of wraps it up. I know we're also running up on our hour here. So just want to thank everyone for joining. Hopefully this was helpful. As always, if you have any other additional questions, never hesitate. Let us know. Happy to help. We will, I think we have another webinar coming up here on the end of the month, more specific to tags, Tag Inspector. Be on the lookout for those emails. And if you're subscribed to receive those updates, be on the lookout. If you're not, sign up. But thanks everyone for joining, and have a great rest of the week.